So we're really thrilled to have a visitor from UCSF today, and Nadia Diamond-Smith, who many of you know, is an associate professor in epidemiology and biostatistics, and is also at the Institute for Global Health Sciences at the University of California, San Francisco. So even though it is raining and nasty, we've learned that this is better than wildfires. We're grateful to have you here in this safe Midwestern space for a moment, if we can call it that. So Dr. Diamond-Smith's expertise is in maternal and reproductive health in the developing world, focusing a lot on gender inequality and women's empowerment. She uses mixed methods and does work in South Asia, as well as in Africa, elsewhere in Asia, and in the US and Latin America. So truly global, comparative, demographically embedded work. So we're thrilled to have you. Please take it away.
Thank you so much for that nice introduction and for organizing all of this and welcoming me here today. This is my first time in Ann Arbor, and I've heard about the Population Studies Center for my whole career, so it's really an honor to be here. And I also just wanted to take a moment before we begin to acknowledge this has been an intense week. 2 weeks, and I know this is a time of a lot of uncertainty, but I'm really thrilled to be here today talking about science and research and the important work that we're all doing, and it's really great to get to meet many of you and hear about the work that you all are doing. So with that, I'm going to be talking about some of the work I have been doing and I'm doing right now on health and empowerment for young newly married women in South Asia. So I'm going to give a little background, though I think most of this is probably familiar to you, talk about a preliminary study in Nepal and then 2 ongoing R01s. And I'm also going to try something a little new. So one thing I've been thinking about a lot is how we often talk a lot about our findings at the end of our projects. And, maybe we do a whip where we're like, oh, how should I do this analysis? But especially for those of us who are doing complicated studies with a lot of data collection or randomized controlled trials, or whatever it might be, there's a lot that goes on before that, which is very complicated. And sometimes there's a lot of challenges and problems and things that go wrong. And at least in my department and where I am, we rarely talk about that. So I've been thinking a lot more about the need for sort of research, postmortems or M&Ms to really learn from each other about strategies we're using to overcome the complexities of collecting data and doing research about complicated topics in different settings. So I'm going to try to do that so you can let me know how that goes. So South Asia. It's rapidly developing. The GDP of South Asia is about twice that of Africa. It's home to a quarter of the world's children, and yet 50% of the world's wasted children live in Asia. So it has an undue burden of poor child health, has higher rates of preterm birth, other adverse birth outcomes, and here I'm mostly talking about South Asia. I'll be talking a lot about India and Nepal in this presentation. Very high rates of anemia among women of reproductive age, low BMI for women throughout their life course. This is a slightly old paper, but I really love it, by Diane Coffey. And the red line is India and the blue is Africa, and it shows the proportion of women who are underweight throughout their life course. So we can really see that it stands out. There's a different pattern. Women's empowerment is also lower in South Asia compared to other parts of the world. So it has some of the lowest indicators of women's status and empowerment globally. Obviously, we could do a whole talk about how we're measuring women's empowerment. I'm not going to do that today. But from a wide variety of different measures, there's relatively high levels of women's educational attainment, yet low labor force participation, high rates of child marriage, IPV, short time between marriage and first birth. So these things come together. So how are these interrelated? In my PowerPoint, there was animation, so just bear with me here. But we can think of women's status can impact the timing of marriage, where maybe women with lower status are more likely to get married early, have a childbirth early, or have more children or more closely spaced children, which can impact maternal and child health outcomes. On the other hand, if we delay the first birth, right, if women are able to delay the first birth, that may allow them to stay in school, have more labor economic opportunities later in life, meet other life goals they might have aside from just reproductive, but also reproductive life goals, which can then have positive impacts on their status. And of course, there's also many ways that women's status impacts the maternal and child health outcomes aside from just through the pathway of marriage and childbearing, but I'm going to be focusing on that main pathway today. And so one of the things I've really been thinking about a lot is what is the impact of gender inequality, low women's status on health across women's life course, and could this explain some of the persistent poor health outcomes that we see in the South Asian setting? So sort of thinking about the nexus of these two factors, that really had helped me focus in on newly married women. And again, I'm going to be going back and forth a little bit between India and Nepal here, but this is some data on Nepal. So the average age of marriage is 18 still for women in Nepal. It's higher in India. And 50% of women are pregnant within 1 year of marriage. And actually, I think that proportion is higher in India when you look at women who've recently been married. Most marriages are still arranged or semi-arranged to a certain extent. Women usually move into their husband's home at the time of marriage, and this might be in a different village, district, state. And you can think about the impacts this has on women's status, right? Loss of their connections to their family, potential challenges with language or understanding the culture. Co-residence is still very common. Early in marriage, women usually move into their husband's households, although this does seem to change throughout the life course. But there's really very little research on newly married preconception women. Most of the focus in public health, for a good reason, is on pregnancy. We really start paying a lot of attention to women when they get pregnant, for delivery, postpartum, and there's also a lot of focus on adolescence. But I think there's this critical gap after women move out of their parents' home, when they first moved into their husband's home, and before they get pregnant. That is a critical time for this intersection of empowerment and health. So with this in mind, I got a KO1 from NICHD a long time ago now, it seems. But this was in Nepal, and I was really interested in understanding the experiences of newly married women and more about this intersection between empowerment and health. And as you'll see with a lot of my work, I primarily use mixed methods, and I do a lot of dyadic and triadic analysis, both of quantitative and qualitative data. So since I'm really interested in households and couples, this often involves interviews with multiple members within the household. So for this, we did qualitative, triadic, in-depth interviews with the newly married woman, the husband, and mother-in-law, and then a longitudinal study with 200 newly married women, and then developed an intervention. So what did we learn? So when we first recruited these women, it was all within 4 months of marriage. Most desired 2 children, and 8.5% had already gotten pregnant. Most didn't want children right away, and about a third said that it would be inconvenient to have a child at this time. And yet 18 months later, almost 80% of them had gotten pregnant or given birth already. And of course, we know that fertility preferences change, and that's a very interesting and complicated thing to be measuring. But just with this longitudinal data in a relatively short time window, we saw that it seems that a lot of women's preferences and desires weren't being met. This graph, we can see the pregnancy intention that was stated at baseline, and then 18 months later, proportion that became pregnant and didn't. While there's some difference, really across the board, most women became pregnant. We found a high desire to delay the first birth. So, I think there's this general perception that in the South Asian context, women, that there's so much pressure to bear children early, that women want to have a birth early. But we really didn't find that among both the young women and their partners. And I'll talk about the mother-in-laws in a minute. But so we found wide acceptance and interest in delaying the first birth. So here we could see a husband. I've used really silly colors here, mostly to help me remember who I'm talking about. But saying that we want to wait till they're more mature. My wife is new to this family. We can wait 1 year or more. In terms of the pressure that couples were experiencing, we found some really interesting mixed findings. So here we see a husband saying, well, I want a child after a year, but my parents want a child sooner. I'm going to be migrating. So thinking about this, I've changed my mind. And this is kind of the standard idea, like, oh, maybe people want to delay, but their parents pressure them. But then from some of the in-laws, we heard some really interesting things. I think this quote is really great. So the woman, the mother-in-law, is really fighting with conflicting preferences. So one standpoint, she gets to see her grandkids, but if she sees, her daughter-in-law waits, her body will be more mature, she'll have strength. But then there's if she gives birth late, the people will talk about her and say she's infertile. So she's really struggling with outside pressure that she perceives from the community, and also, her own desires and knowledge maybe about health things. So then she ends with, so I feel like she should give birth within a year, right? We also found fairly little communication about childbearing among newly married couples. Well, who should I talk with? My husband is always busy. I feel shy to talk about these things. And related to this, fairly low family planning use. Mostly it was a joint decision. About a quarter had ever used a method. And the reasons for non-use really centered around lack of interest and then lack of knowledge. So here's a woman saying she wants to wait, but my husband is not willing to use any birth control. And then on the other hand, my husband doesn't know about contraception, told him to buy condoms. He says he feels shy, right? So we saw a mixture of a knowledge gap, but also, sort of the more lack of interest and desire for early childbearing. So then shifting to a new area of interest of mine was around norms and behaviors around eating, right? When we're thinking about preconception health, we can think about nutrition with all those low indicators for BMI and anemia. So 70% of women reported eating less of at least one type of food since moving into their husband's home. So we recruited them, they'd been living at home just a month or a couple months earlier. So we asked them, how have things changed since you moved into your husband's home? And 50% reported eating last, always, or usually. So here we have a quote from a husband is, oh, she doesn't eat with us. She eats after we finish. And then asked him some more questions, but, oh yeah, she has enough food. We tell her to cook food if it's insufficient, but she eats less usually, and she tells us the food is sufficient, right? So we can get the sense that even other household members are aware that, women often might not be eating as much as other members of the household. And then we saw very limited mobility among this population. So at that first survey, 50% of women reported that they had not left the house since marriage. And this did decline over time, but still is fairly high. And I think this quote is very powerful and sad. Like, I like to go, but who allows me? My husband doesn't have time. I'm helpless. How can we have free time after marriage? I mean, our life becomes imprisoned. We live like a prisoner. Yes, like a chained animal. So we saw a lot of sadness among the women about what their life was like as a newly married women, and also awareness that these factors were all interrelated. So here we have someone saying, I want more information about food and nutrition, but to have this, I have to go out of the house. And how can I go out of the house, right? So we could see that, we can think, oh, okay, for family planning, they have to have mobility, obviously, but other things, people were aware that this limited mobility was impacting their ability to seek the information and source resources that they needed. And also we found fairly poor indicators of mental health. As you can hear just from that quote, from the newly married women, pretty high rates of crying, low energy, sadness. And then when we did some analysis, we found that some of these markers of empowerment were indeed related to women's mental health. So eating last, right? And, I saw eating last and women's order of eating is something I'm really interested in. And, in talking to colleagues, I found sometimes people are like, oh, well, that's just a cultural tradition. And like the women don't mind. It's, it's like, and I think that this was really interesting because it showed that women did feel that they felt a mark, a stigma, an impact of some of these practices on their own, on their mental health. And we also found that marital relationship quality was associated with mental health. So one of the things, of course, so we see these women have very low status. And one of our questions is like, so how does this change? And I think, the answer is usually, well, she gives birth, right? She has a baby, that's going to improve her status in her household. And so I've been really interested in that. And we tried to look at this with this pretty small data set. So it's something I'm hoping to look at more. So, and of course, what are we going to use to mark women's status? So we first tried to look at intimate partner violence, which was fairly high and increased throughout marriage. And we found, against our hypothesis, that pregnancy actually increased of women's odds of experiencing IPV. So here we didn't see the birth is the golden ticket that's going to increase her status in the household. And then we also looked at access to food and nutrition and labor force participation. And we found that being pregnant, it was a little more complicated because we also included food insecurity there, because this is a fairly food insecure part of Nepal. And we found that becoming pregnant and labor force participation did increase dietary diversity, but it was only for women who were in food secure households. And it wasn't sustained postpartum. So that really made me think that like, oh, we're giving people good messaging about like feeding pregnant women, but then then it kind of fades, right? We need to work on like what's happening in that postpartum period. And we found that women who gave birth in food insecure households had an increased likelihood of eating last. So this is really an important gap in opportunity, right? So we know that women's status in their households and communities is low in South Asia. It's associated with several poor maternal reproductive child health outcomes. Women have very low status early in marriage due to these confounding factors: young age, co-residence, arranged marriages, and this impacts pregnancy, nutrition. So my question was really, could the time of marriage be an opportunity to promote healthy patterns, right? If this is a new time, people are just forming new relationships, and can we try to strengthen those relationships, increase communication, decision-making in the household to set this marriage and the whole household dynamics on a different trajectory, so that it's not harder to change into healthy behaviors later, right? You know, if someone tells you, oh, you should like start talking to your husband about family planning 10 years after you've been married, like that's going to be a lot harder if you already have certain dynamics set, right? So how can we change these things early on? And of course, we also know that the preconception period is an important time for health beside all these things and is neglected, I think, globally. And most interventions wait to intervene until pregnancy, which is problematic due to late pregnancy, care seeking in some settings. And of course, also just to note that improving women's health outside of just the fact that she might get pregnant should also be a priority. So thinking about these very low status women with poor health just on their own, this is like, should be a critical area of focus. So with that, my partners in Nepal and the local NGO that we were working with on the ground in Nepal, we went through a process along with stakeholders in the community and based on all this feedback to develop an intervention called Sumador, which means best relationship. And it's a 4-month weekly group intervention for newly married women, their husbands and mother-in-laws, coming together with other newly married women and husbands and mother-in-laws in their community. So this little diagram here shows how it's like all the different people from the households all come together. Here's a list of sort of the focus of the different concepts. So it really was around, the focus was around relationships, you know, breaking down some of the gender, social, the hierarchies, getting people to start talking to each other, getting people to start knowing each other, with the main focus being around nutrition and sort of the fertility, family planning a little bit. Here's some pictures. It was piloted during COVID. And again, like really the idea was is can we address individual, household, and community level norms? Like so often I think, I don't know if any of you has faced this, but I hear people saying like, well, especially women, like, oh, well, I've been told I should eat green leafy vegetables or take my IFA pills, but somebody else, right? It's the same thing with the fertility. Like, well, I want this, but somebody else wants this. So like, can we try to get at all these different, the knowledge and the norms of all the different people and the community together in one intervention? So again, this was a fairly small pilot. We did see some impact on knowledge about family planning among all 3 household members, an increase in the proportion of women saying that they were likely to use contraception in the future. Here we have a quote from a woman earlier. We, husband and wife, never used to talk openly, but it's changed. We talk openly. Love has increased between us. Similar norms around the timing of the first pregnancy and son preference. So you can see a woman saying, my mother-in-law had a very old way of thinking. She wanted me to give birth right away, but now she tells me to have a baby after completing my studies, getting a better job. I'm happy to see this change. Some mother-in-laws, you know, I want my daughter to study. There's still time for them to bear children. And also some shift in the son preference, which is something that I'm really interested in. And we had a specific session on, you know, in the old time, we used to have babies until the son was born, but now the daughter-in-laws don't have to wait, or I think she means like continue childbearing until she has a son. In terms of contraception, we also saw a shift in more acceptance. I don't think anyone should force people to give birth. It's the husband and wife's decision. They shouldn't be under anyone's influence. And then we saw an increase in disagreement about it being wrong to use contraceptions to avoid or delay pregnancy. The question about avoiding or delaying the first birth was a little harder to shift because I think that norm is a little bit more entrenched, but we did see an increase in the proportion of participants disagreeing with that over time. And then to the eating practices, we saw a change in the proportion of households where the family doesn't eat together or where the newly married woman eats last most of the time. We can see a husband saying, we all eat together now. My wife eats more nutritious food like green vegetables, meat. We tell her to rest. And then a woman talking about knowledge she learned. I used to hear that to prevent an unborn baby from gaining weight, pregnant women were prevented from eating nutritious food and iron, but I came to know these aren't true. So, you know, I think that there was really positive evidence that people were absorbing this information and being able to actually enact changes within their household. I really love this green quote. I know it's really big, but one of the things that I think is really exciting and interesting about this is the relationships, right? So I'm going to read most of this one. Going with my son and daughter-in-law, I came to know many things. It was easier to go with them. I would have been too shy to go alone. but going together has become easier. I'd always wondered how my daughter-in-law would be, as she was recently married. I hadn't known her well. I got an opportunity to know her while going to the program. We used to go together, talk, and discuss about the things after we'd come back. We perform work together. I had a negative attitude toward my daughter-in-law earlier, which has changed now. And I feel like this is really, powerful and exciting to me to see, right? Because I think that really shows that this time when the relationships are new is a potentially really a great time to be strengthening those bonds. And here's a woman talking about changes in the household and even with her husband. Previously, my husband used to force me for sexual relations. He doesn't do that now. So it's very exciting and powerful. So from this, we developed 2 R01s. And so one of them is really the coming more directly off of what I've just presented. The focus is on preconception nutritional status. The households, it has that same structure where households meet together, and that's in Nepal, and that one was recently funded just in September. And then sort of based on some things we were hearing earlier on related to the timing of the first birth, I didn't present this, so we kept hearing women saying, we go to school all this time now, and then I get married and I can't do anything, and if only I could use some of that knowledge I got, if I had some skills, if I could do a little something, maybe that would help me be able to delay the first birth, or that would be acceptable. And we saw some acceptance among the husbands and the mother-in-laws for this idea. So we were kind of okay, we're hearing women say if they had some kind of skill or be it more of a life skill. We actually initially wanted to give them an actual skill. And I tried to write an R01 on that, and that didn't go very far. So we switched it more to life skills. But would this be able to help women negotiate and be able to delay the first birth? And so that we ended up doing that one in India. So I'm quickly going to talk about the new R01 that stems directly from the K that I just suggested. So again, it's the same household level structure, but we ended up deciding to combine it with multiple micronutrient supplements. We went back and forth a lot, can a behavior change intervention? We wanted the main outcome to be anemia. Can it really change something like anemia? And we thought probably not. And we know that nutritional supplements have been fraught with a lot of challenges, right? A lot of people are given IFA and don't take them. And, the same with a number of other supplements. So some type of information, norm change is needed. So we were okay, well, we'll just propose that we combine these two and look at the impact of the two of them combined. So this is our beautiful conceptual model about both the access to MMS combined with the group intervention, how it will impact the norms, empowerment, household practices, and the knowledge, which can impact both the diet side of things and the adherence to supplements, with the main outcome being anemia. We are doing this in 70 villages. We're collecting quantitative data from the husband, woman, and mother-in-law. So there's 2,100 people in it. They'll be followed every 6 months for 18 months. We're also collecting blood draws, which is something new for me. And then we're doing concurrent in-depth longitudinal qualitative interviews with a subset of triads. So interviewing few household triads at multiple time points in the study. So here's my first step at things that you learn when you start a study. Turns out being ahead of the game can be challenging. So apparently the evidence on MMS preconception is not as far along as we thought it would be by the time this grant got funded. I have a colleague who's a nutritional epidemiologist on it with me, and we were yeah, this is going to be great. And now that we're doing it, we're getting a little bit more pushback about well, does there even need to be MMS in the preconception period? So really this should be a 3-arm trial, which we talked about. Where there was no space to fund in an NIH study, and we've been trying to get a fund. We thought maybe we found someone to fund a 3rd arm, and that's not going to happen. So, but that's a little bit of a struggle. Somewhat related, MMS is not approved even for pregnancy yet in Nepal, which we thought it would be. The WHO guidelines have shifted to recommend MMS. Some countries have adopted that, not Nepal. And not only is it not available, it's actually technically illegal. Because there's something that's in the MMS, which is on some list that was banned 40 years ago, and the government's in the process of getting that changed, but that hasn't happened yet. So we know some other researchers have successfully gotten a government letter saying you can use this for research, so we're trying to do that. But then, of course, now we have to get it donated, and then they'll only ship it to the US, and then we've got to figure, so it's just turns out to be really complicated. And then we've also learned that Nepal is more restrictive about blood samples being shipped out of country than we expected. I think we thought that maybe the quality of the labs in Nepal, that they were able to analyze some of the things we wanted, and that's not the case. So we're also in the midst of figuring that out too. So fun times. I'm mostly going to talk about the other R1, which is a little further along. And so this is Terang, which is group-based life skills. So again, this is really focused on that thing we kept hearing women say. We're like, oh, if we just had a little bit, a little bit more of something that we could, some more communication, some more skills, also theoretically some more like actual practical skills that might help us be able to delay the first birth. So the main outcome there is avoiding unintended pregnancies. And I feel like with this project, I also, we kept hearing this message from women, and I was like, this seems like the kind of things that there's a lot of NGOs in India and probably elsewhere in the world that are doing these type of things, right? And us as outsiders, we often come in and we like create this beautiful thing that we like, we hopefully partner with the community to do it. But like, wouldn't it be great if we could kind of take something that like a local NGO is already doing and really evaluate that? This is another maybe like lesson learned from me about why that's hard to do. But we spent my amazing postdoc, Lakshmi Gopalakrishnan, whose name you'll see here many times. So she and I spent a lot of time talking to various NGOs in India, and we identified a partner who's basically doing empowerment, very similar things than what we had in mind. They didn't really have a health component, so we thought we could like work together, make it a little more structured so that we could do it through an RCT where it would be pretty standardized. But we were excited about this idea of, and they were doing some work with newly married women, but we had to like shift the focus a little bit. So there was like a little bit of guidance and restructuring, but we were really mostly seeing, also with that idea of like scale up, right? Like what we always hear is like, oh, these are so great, you're nice group interventions, but like, is this ever going to be scaled up? And first of all, I would say that these type of things are very inexpensive in the context I'm working. So I don't actually think it's crazy to think about them being scaled up, and the health system isn't the only way to do it. So that's why I like thinking about working with an NGO was interesting to me. So again, it's somewhat similar, but the groups are only with the newly married women, since it's really focused on their empowerment, their life skills, and reproductive health, which is slightly more sensitive. But it's the same like group model, meeting a couple times a month, very interactive. We did decide to add some light touch sessions for the husbands and mother-in-laws, which I'll talk about more in a little bit. But in the initial structure, it was they each got 4 sessions in groups, also the husbands together and mother-in-laws together. These are the topics that are covered. So again, it's really more about reproductive health side of things, empowerment, right? We see some negotiation, some personal finance. We actually added like a tech module, like understanding how to use technology, trying to, help women get connected to that. And then things around gender equitable norms, IPV, etc., consent. And here's our conceptual model about how these different components will impact skills around awareness and knowledge, also efficacy, self-esteem, pregnancy as a choice, shifting gender attitudes, hopefully impact couples communication, some levels of empowerment and gender norms, which will then impact family planning use, desires, family planning use, and then hopefully can help women who want to avoid a pregnancy be able to meet their reproductive goals. It's a similar structure as the other one. Women are in clusters. The main difference is that eligibility includes women saying that they want to delay the first birth, right? We recognize that some women want to have a birth right away. So at the recruitment screening phase, we asked women if they wanted to wait, did not want to have a pregnancy at this time, which of course is a really hard question to ask people, especially in this setting where a lot of women kind of didn't think of pregnancy as a choice. So we've spent a lot of time going back and forth about like how we can do this. And again, following women for 18 months with surveys. And then we do have the same sort of triadic longitudinal IDIs. So since this was slightly new, we did a small pilot before we launched the RCT, so within the R01, because we were, kind of adapting the content from that our NGO partners had developed. We found that women mostly liked it. They appreciated the topics. It was a lot harder than, for example, the project in Nepal. There was a lot more shyness. I think the population in Rajasthan is tribal, which was also another lesson learned and extra challenging community to be working with. And so getting women to come and getting them to open up has been more challenging. And attendance has been more of a struggle in the pilot. Women seem to go back to their natal homes. They have a lot more responsibilities and for festivals and rituals and grass cutting season and things like that. So participation has been harder. We really liked this idea of engaging the men, but that was very, very challenging. This is an area of high migration, even just to local cities to work. So it was very hard to get the husbands to attend, but they really loved it. So it was very hard to decide what to do about this because they really expressed very eloquently that like no one ever talks to them and like no one ever engages them and no one had ever talked to them about things like consent or these type of things. And so they really wanted it, but it was like incredibly hard to get them. So this is something that we've been struggling with. The mother-in-law session seemed to work with this like light touch 4-session model. So based on this, we did make some changes. We increased the number of rapport building sessions with the newly married women. We made the timing a little more flexible based on their work and return, festivals and these type of things. We added more pictures and videos to try to make it a little bit more comfortable for them. We ended up switching, sadly, the husbands to like a WhatsApp group where weekly they get like messages that are like along the same, just because like we could not get them to come. And like our poor moderators were going out and like meeting with them one-on-one because they couldn't get them to come on. It was just like scaling this up. It just didn't seem feasible. But I'm sad about that and would love to hear people, if anyone's found better ways to engage men. The mother-in-laws, we pretty much kept them the same way, but we added some more health topics that they really wanted to hear about. Again, the population that does not get, and some of these mother-in-laws are like younger than me, they're like in their 30s. It's like really amazing. But they're fairly young and no one's ever talked to them about things like menopause or care-seeking behaviors. And so I think this is also a really neglected population and area that needs more focus. So the current status of our RCT, so we recruited the first half of the sample last marriage season. The intervention was done. Here's a mother-in-law who got her little certificate. People really like the certificates. And this is just like this is like last week they sent this. And then we're doing this first follow-up survey, I guess. First follow-up survey is going on now, and then we're about to recruit. So we decided to recruit half of the participants in 1 year, and then we're going to recruit the second half the second year, which turns out to be an amazing choice we made because so many things went wrong the first time around, which I'm going to talk about. So this is not my 10 commandments of a cluster randomized control trial. Found this, here's the reference, but cluster randomized control trials are really tough. And I think that people choose them for a variety of reasons. For us, we had to because our intervention is a group, right? So some of these don't apply to us, but it still has been definitely a learn. And actually I have another R01, which is also a cluster randomized control trial. So I'm just like my mind is blowing up with how to do these. So knowing the ICC ahead of time is hard. Like we did this pilot, which helped us a little bit, but it's really hard to be sure. And you really need a lot of clusters, which is really tough. And you need to enroll everybody and before you randomize them, or you need to like do the baseline and recruit everyone before you randomize them is how you're supposed to do it. And this can be really hard in interventions where the timing of when the groups start is important, right? So like my other R01 is like women have to be within a certain stage of pregnancy, or like here, right? We want them to all have just been married. So it's really complicated. So some of our lessons learned, so like in this study, right? We want our participants are newly married women. We want them to have been married as recently as possible so they aren't already pregnant and they can get the most out of our intervention. South Asia has a marriage season, which has pros and cons for us in this situation. So most marriages happen within like a very defined window. So we had to start recruiting like basically at like one time of year. So there'd been enough marriages but we wouldn't start having had people be married too long, and there was no being like, okay, whenever our IRBs and stuff is ready, we'll go. It was like, it has to happen now or it's not going to happen. And that also means that you need to have a large team that you're able to mobilize like all at once to do all the different phases of it and start the intervention immediately, which is like very hard to plan for and manage. Then of course you need to worry about having enough newly married women in this setting in each group to form a group of a large enough size. Within any village, there's only so many women who get married. It's hard to predict that. In this setting, it's not like you send out your wedding invitation 12 months in advance. It's like much more rapid, it seems like. So it was hard to know where there was going to be newly married women. So we really faced a lot of challenges. So here's our really depressing flow diagram. So we did a lot of preparation, right? We did that pilot I told you about where we learned all these things. We went to all the villages and we asked, like, is there a lot of migration here? Like, is there going to be support from the community? We chose villages. We went and listed every household in all those villages, asked where we thought there was going to be marriages. We selected villages from there, and then it just did not go as planned. We thought we had a total of about 542 women in 2 blocks. One of the blocks we ended up dropping totally because the estimates of how many newly married women appeared to be completely off from what had been told to our listing team or recorded by our listing team. We're not exactly sure what happened. The other area, we were able to recruit 434 women, randomize them into intervention and control. But then between when we recruited them, there was 194, and whoever even showed up was only 117. And then by the end of it, about only 60 people like really came more than once, right? So these are like huge drop-offs, not what we saw in my Nepal study, not what we saw in our pilot. So we're trying to figure out what to do. So we're planning to increase the sample size for phase 2. Fortunately, we did it in 2 phases. So we get a second phase to try again. But this has cost implications. We're hoping to select areas with less migration, easier terrain, larger villages, but then we run the risk of too many women potentially. Also, you know, if we go anywhere too urban, this type of intervention might not quite be as like acceptable or appropriate. This is what our partners on the ground think. We're really trying to reduce that drop between who was recruited and who showed up the first time, because that seems to be like a critical place that we could be better at. So what we're planning to do is both reduce that gap, but have like a fake session basically, and we only recruit people who show up once to a group meeting. But then of course we also have to do that in the control, because that means that we want those same types of women who are willing to show up once to be in our control villages. So that also adds costs, has cost implications. So I think my final takeaway from all of this, and maybe especially right now in our global climate, is to expect the unexpected, be very flexible, and really to share challenges with each other. I've really gained a lot from talking to other people who've been running large studies and large trials about, you know, the crazy things that they've faced and how they've solved them. And I think we can really learn a lot from each other. So with that, I'd like to thank NICHD, who funds all my work, my amazing partners across both of these projects in India and Nepal, many students and colleagues, program officers, field teams, RAs, participants. This picture on the bottom is me and some of my colleagues at like 6:30 in the morning hiking out to a study site, and I really love, it's amazing all the work that everyone does. So that, thank you very much.
Fantastic. I can kick things off. Thank you, Nadia. This is super exciting and interesting to hear about your multiple projects and get a better understanding of how they all overlap. One thing I'm curious about is the data collection in the control arm in the terrain project, the last one you talked about. How have your response rates been? Like, what are you collecting data from them, and what is the control arm essentially?
Yeah, so at the big picture, the control arm gets the intervention after the data, after 18 months. So we will offer the groups in those communities. Won't be doing very limited anymore, but we still think that a lot of the content is totally relevant and important for them. There's theoretically been some light touch kind of showing up by our NGO partners. I guess I didn't end up talking about this. It turns out that the initial NGO we were working with, they struggled to understand some of the things that, from a research perspective, we were hoping would happen, needed to happen. So for the second phase, we've also shifted to a slightly different model of how who's implementing intervention, so that we know that more. I think that not a lot of, the idea was that like every month or two, someone would show up in the control villages to kind of like remain, have a little context, so that when we came around for the 6-month first follow-up interview, you know, we could like still find. So that's going on right now. So I can tell you in a few weeks about what, I think a big question in that flow diagram is like how many people we're able to recruit. Like, are we just gonna be able to collect the second round of surveys from those like 60 people who showed up regularly? What's it even gonna look like in the control? It's gonna be comparable in the control, so you're gonna get a lot more information very soon. But
Nadia, this was awesome. Thank you so much. So I'm reminded of a project that I did with a colleague in school nursing about group-based antenatal care.
yeah,
We did a 14-site cluster randomized control trial of group-based antenatal care, and it was multiple visits, all of these same issues. one of the things that seems to be helpful now, obviously, when women are pregnant going for prenatal care, they have a different set of motivations for returning. But one of the things that the whole program was oriented around the women as a group reinforcing each other, so that it wasn't as much like the midwife telling them things and teaching them things. It was more like, how can they support each other? So there were all these really cool exercises like, you take a piece of yarn and you say something, you pass it on to your person, and then they make a big spider web, and they talk about how like the web can be supportive. And the women loved that. So I'm wondering if there might be ways that you could build in things like that to help people want to come back, so it's more than just about.
I mean, I think that there's a lot of like games and activities and song, especially the like Rajasthan one, and like they're like dancing and singing all the time, it seemed to. But I mean, I do think that learning from the pregnancy, the centering pregnancy and prenatal care models is something we've thought about a lot and talked about a lot as like a model for how that seems to have succeeded very well. So yeah, it's a good idea. I mean, we should definitely. We're trying to collect. We were hoping it. One of the things I didn't present on this, but from the case study, women just said that they had like no one they could talk to in there. They've all moved into a new place. They don't know anybody, right? They don't even know who the other newly married women are. So we're hoping that just bringing them together will be like, oh, hey, look, there's this other newly married woman from somewhere else in your village who now you know. So we're definitely going to try to measure if there is any like, any change in social support or connections, and like we ask them like, how often do you talk to people in your group outside the group? So we're trying, I don't know if we're gonna do it, but we have that idea and we'll see if it has managed to succeed it, but yeah.
Oh, fun. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was very interesting. One of the questions I had is, because you talked about how the intervention was directed at the newly married women, the mother-in-law, and the husband, and kind of piggybacking off of that point. What were the different, I noticed in the qualitative, in your news, quite a jump in like mentalities of like the mother-in-laws, for example, and the husband. Can you talk more about the actual intervention strategies that were used, and like how, it seems like such a major shift, and if you think that change mindset was something that was like only something more so noted right after the intervention, or was those sustainable, changes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why for the RCT we're doing is like longitudinal triad of qualitative reviews, because that data I presented was like right after, it's like a month or two after the intervention ended, so it's possible that was a short-term impact. So hopefully the larger study will tell us more about that. I mean, I think I was really interested in this. I'm always like, how these mother-in-laws were newly married women, like how could they? And so one of the activities we actually had them do was like talk about to the group, which includes their own family members, like what it was like for them as a newly married women. And there's some quotes of mother-in-laws being like, I never really thought back about, like I think that, we all are living our life and we often aren't thinking about, what are these behaviors I'm enacting, like where did they come from, like anyways. And so, there's a lot of like, for the gender role stuff, having like the different members play different roles in some kind of enactment, right? Like the husband would have to be the young, newly married woman, so we tried to get people to put themselves more in each other's shoes, maybe to like understand, but I'd be happy to share the module, the training manual, which has like there's like tons of activities and games and things like that.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was really interesting. I loved like the behind the scenes kind of work stuff. I have two questions. I think they both relate to the first study that you talked about. The first is I was really interested in like all of the quotes about not being able to leave the house. And I was particularly interested in like, is that, I guess, is it a short-term thing for this post-marriage period, and like they had more autonomy before they got married, and then also like once they have several children, do they leave the house more to, have children navigate the world? Is it like a specific period, or is it a context in which women aren't?
I mean, I think definitely women talked about having more free. Like I used to be able to go to the market when I was at my parents' house. Yeah. They were able to do things when they moved to their husband's house, and I think a lot of it qualitatively people will tell you it has to do with the like making sure the baby's the guy's baby, or, you know, like related to child bearing and protecting whatever that is supposed to be. And I can't remember, I feel like I assume I looked at the impact of childbirth on mobility, because it would seem crazy if I didn't do that at some point. I clearly didn't write a paper on it, so I should, I mean, and maybe just like the sample, I think like limited mobility was so high. But yeah, I mean, maybe the larger one will be able to see more. But I think, you know, what you'll hear qualitatively is that when she has kids, she's able to start leaving the house when she has to.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's one of the things that I was kind of interested in with the pilot in both of these is just like, are women even able to come? Like, part of me was just like, I don't need to measure anything else. I just want to see.
Yeah.
Like, so many people be like, they're never going to let their newly married daughters go to this. Like, that's what I kept hearing, you know, especially. And I think the Nepal one, because they all went together, that like kind of facilitated that even more. But I think one of the issues, I guess we start with the India one where the women go alone, that we might, part of the reason for that low attendance might just be it's harder to get the women to come.
Yeah.
Even though often our like moderators would go household to household and go like get each woman to come. So it's even like she was like walking through by herself. But it's just a huge amount of work to get these women to be able to come.
Yeah.
So.
And then my second question is maybe a little bit related, but I was really interested in the part of your talk where you're talking about like status improving after having children. It sounded like the data didn't totally bear that out. But do you think, I mean, it sounds like that's like a belief. Like, do you think that there is like some way in which their status can improve through fertility, or do you think it's just?
I mean, I think that maybe the sex of the baby has an impact. This sample is too small to measure that.
Yeah.
But I hope in the larger one, that maybe touch on, you know, do one or more. I mean, I think that's also what you would hear qualitatively, that that really increases women's stat. I tried to look at it with DHS data, which was problematic at some point, but
Yeah, I was gonna
It's
say,
over
it seems like
far.
one could maybe.
yeah.
Yeah, super. Anyway, I think.
Yeah.
So there's a couple from the Zoom. So Jessica asked, since I'm in the early stages of starting up community-engaged, community-based research, I'm interested in how these partnerships are formed. Can you elaborate on how you identified NGO partners?
Yeah, great question, and also the most important question for anything. I've learned the hard way in projects I'm not talking about how that can go awry. Yeah, I mean, so my partners in Nepal, I worked with in my K, and they had previously worked with other UCSF faculty, and so that has been very positive, shared. We really like developed a lot of these ideas together. So I think the more you can rely on, again, you're now with these people here who, you know, have worked with partners and have built relationships and there's trust. I mean, for the NGO, again, as I said, like I spent a lot of time talking with different people, and we even asked for like references, like other people they worked with, but it didn't turn out to go as we had hoped. So I think it's really hard with building, and I would say that if you find good partners, like keep working with them. Like now I will like only write grants with people that I know really well that it works, and I can use, yeah. So that's not helpful for someone early on, but I think relying on your network that has other connections is really helpful.
And then Charles asked, I request for Nadia to speak more about what they did for the group that faced migration issues in phase 1 of the RCT.
I mean, we were sad. I mean, it was I think so this area, you know, we tried asking people, do you have plans to migrate? Or does your husband have plans to migrate? Even though we asked that early on, a lot of people just migrated more quickly, and a lot more women lived with their husbands than we thought. So I think we didn't like maybe focus enough on that. We were like, oh, if the husband goes, like she'll stay. But it turns out like this part of for the Rajasthan, this part of area, a lot of people like moved to bigger cities for workforce opportunities. We're trying for the data collection to still follow up over phone, so we'll see how that goes. But it's a real big challenge. You know, I mean, it's one of the reasons we kind of ended up through the WhatsApp group. So you're like, maybe then we'll keep some of the husbands who are gone somewhat engaged. I have some at my other project in India with it's a group project as an health intervention for postpartum women, so maybe like an health approach. You know, that has different pros and cons. But we use Zoom there for group calls over Zoom with postpartum women, and it's been going pretty well. So I think, technology is changing and people can use it, and even trying to build social connection. Like our idea there is, can you build social connection to support postpartum mental health over Zoom in India? And, I think there's opportunities.
So a lot of this type of intervention depends on like people being receptive to it and relationships being able to change. Do you have any sense if like some of the non-participation is based on like families or certain people being less receptive to like the information being less open to these kinds of changes, and especially like the husband, like if you give information to the newly married woman and she takes it to the husband and he's open to the consequences there.
Yeah.
So yeah, are you able to like measure kind of attitudes or receptivity to kind of at the baseline?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're gonna have a lot of data digging and soul searching once we get the second round of data, which again is being collected right now to see, like, if we're able to reach some of the people who did attend, we'll learn a lot from that. And if we aren't able to reach those people, then we're gonna have to go back and look at how they, what they said in the baseline. And, it's interesting for me because, so the K, which is the group model with all the people from the household, that was like, seemed very effective, right? And like, there was very high participation and people really loved it. And there was a very minimal, it was so easy, and I think maybe it was like, great, we'll just do this in Rajasthan and we'll change it a little bit. And so I think I've learned that that's not as easy. I don't know if it's the setting, the culture, migration, the just having the women on their own. I don't know what the issue is going to be, but they're definitely trying to figure it out. But yeah, I think it might just be that it's maybe not as acceptable to be talking about these things to the newly married women in this setting as the families want to let people go, etc. So stay tuned.
This is more of a logistical question, but for the recruitment, given that a lot of these households are patrilocal and the women are moving into the villages, when you were recruiting for newly married women, did you kind of focus on houses where there were young men who were maybe going to be married soon, or because if a lot of the women aren't there yet, how did you kind of approach that, the household structure aspect of where newly married women?
Yeah, so that was one of the things that, we tried to ask in that listing, is there likely to be any marriages in this household soon? And, even though I think that listing when it started was March, April, and then we went back to do the actual baseline recruitment in May, June, it wasn't, also the Rajasthan is tribal. We really made our lives more hard because there's marriage, the way it happens is super different also, where people get married officially really young, but then they don't move in yet right away. So we were also we thought those people were, as long as they started living together soon, that was okay. So we were trying to balance a whole bunch of different, cultural practices around what marriage means, in terms of who we would recruit. We were really interested in new exposure to sex. We decided was what we were really interested in. And also living together, because that's when relationships start to form. So, but yeah, it was really, it just didn't that. We did try to focus on the households that we thought there could be a new marriage soon, but it was harder than expected. We ended up also extending the window longer for that study because it was so hard. I also think it's a hilly, tough terrain you can see from this picture, right? So the villages are spread out, so who would even be possible to come to a weekly session? Logistically, it's just much tougher. Choose your studies state wisely. That's would be one of my tips.
Looks like we might be at an end with our questions, so I'd like to thank our speaker for this fascinating talk and difficult research that you're doing and important findings. Thank you so much.